Helen, you're most welcome this evening. Thank you for giving up time in what I know has been a very busy parliamentary day for you. We're sorry you can't be here in person, but I think we decided between us that the chances you'd be called back to vote or do something were so high that it was much better to have the certainty of putting this online. But thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Fr Adrian, for inviting me. That was very kind of you.
You're most welcome. We met quite a few years ago, I suspect rather more years than either of us cares to remember, when as a very young head teacher in Glasgow, I had a letter from an MP, which as I opened it frightened me, and I thought, oh goodness, what have I done to get a letter from an MP? And you were pursuing a matter about access to education on behalf of one of your constituents. And I was very struck at the time, because having studied politics myself and the way the political system works, I suppose like a lot of people, I thought that MPs worked there in Westminster, and I didn't really know about the local advocacy work that goes on all the time. And what you presented me was an incredibly cogent analysis of a situation, and something we would never have thought of, and it was all resolved in the way you hoped it would be resolved at the time. And I was just really impressed by that sort of individual care that you were able to give. So I wondered, could you just talk a little bit about, how you got involved in politics? How did you go from St Patrick's High School, Coatbridge, and end up very quickly elected to John Smith's seat in 1994? Yeah. And then very quickly on to be Economic Secretary to the Treasury a couple of years later. Just tell us the story, maybe.
Well, my father, who was a bus driver, was a very active trade unionist. And my mother, for much of my life, was an invalid. So she was in and out of hospital quite a lot. So if my father was going to a union meeting, I had to go along with him because I was an only child and there was nobody else to look after me. So I got my sort of baptism in trade unionism at a pretty young age. And my family was a Labour family. My father's sister's brother-in-law was actually the Member of Parliament for Bothwell. He was an ex-miner. And ironically, fast forward a good few decades, it was actually in the Airdrie and Shotts constituency that I finally ended up in. But I'd always said I was never, ever going to go to Parliament. I liked working for the Labour Party, and I did quite a variety of different jobs at one time. But going back to how I ended up in the Treasury and things like that, I went to a school where there was a really quite dominant headmaster, St Pat's Coatbridge, and he made it absolutely clear in an area where there was quite a lot of sectarianism that pupils from St Patrick's were going to go to the top of their professions. He'd sort of picked out everybody's profession. I was going to be between a lawyer or a teacher, and when I became an economist, I don't think he was terribly pleased. And I applied to university thinking I was going to be a lawyer, and then came under the spell of a man called Sir Kenneth Alexander, who was the professor of politics, of economics at Strathclyde University. And I remember in a freshers week listening to him, and I knew instinctively that I was going to be an economist. So I went to Strathclyde University, did a degree in economics, and my very first job, pushed to some extent by Sir Kenneth Alexander, was as head of the economic department at the Scottish TUC. And it was quite unusual for a young woman to do a job like that. And it was at the time of Upper Clyde shipbuilders. And I remember going into the shipyards because he'd got a fair amount of free work from us when we were students, because we did a cost benefit analysis there and he was the chairman. And I loved the fact that a whistle would blow for a tea break, 2 whistles for a lunch break. And one day I heard 3 whistles, and I said to the man I was working with, what's the 3 whistles? Oh, that's to say the lassies here, behave yourself. So that was my induction into the trade union movement. And then I went briefly to the BBC and they sent me to Parliament, despite the fact I was economics correspondent. and I hated Parliament and said I didn't want to go to Parliament. So I became General Secretary of the Labour Party, and at that time you were banned from applying for parliamentary seats, and I thought I was home and dried. But then fast forward, and John was a very dear friend, represented the constituency I'd been born and brought up in. And I still kept saying after John died, I'm not doing it, I'm not doing it. I've got a 9-year-old and a 16-year-old, I'm not doing it. And at his funeral, Donald Dewar and Derry Irvine, who went on to become the Lord Chancellor, both of their orations were about public service. And I was sitting next to James Mackay, who was the then Lord Chancellor, a Free Presbyterian. And he turned to me and said, public service. So as we left the church, my husband turned to me and said, you've got to do it. So that's how I ended up in Parliament. So that's a long way around.
No, it's a fascinating way around. Just go back to the economics a bit. So when you were choosing to do economics, what was the impetus there? What was the attraction there? Because I mean, it's not really a school subject. So
it was the ability to change the world. You know, as a young student, we saw it as a way of actually working at change and making change happen, not just through industrial change, but also social change as well. And I got very, very fired up by that. And in fact, you know, the school I went to, again, fast forwarding a good few years, was the first state school in Britain to produce 2 serving cabinet ministers. Myself and John Reid. We were shortly followed by the Miliband brothers, but we joined at the same time, John and I, and it was all down to going to a school that emphasised you had to be engaged in broader things than just what was happening in your own community.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that's not something that's only in Catholic schools. It's in all kinds of schools, but it's something that certainly we would want to see in Catholic schools. I think it would be very difficult for a Catholic school to claim to be Catholic unless it had that dimension in it. So can you just talk a little bit, because this is about, you know, faith and politics, maybe just a little bit about the faith angle. So you talked about changing the world, and it seems to me that's what the gospel inspires us to do, to change the world. How does that work for you?
Well, it's quite interesting we're having this conversation today, because I began this morning with a service in St Margaret's Chapel, which is the little chapel at the side of Westminster Abbey. It's known as the Parliamentary Church, and the new moderator of the Church of Scotland was down and took the service there. And the whole theme was about how if you commit yourself to a life in politics, you really are committing yourself to trying to make the world better. And that's, you know, that transcends all political parties. No one should be in politics if they don't believe that they have something to contribute to make the world a much better place. And faith, people don't realise the extent to which faith plays a part in the political system. For example, every day in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the session begins with prayers. It's never broadcast, it can't be broadcast because it's all done in private. But since time immemorial, there have been prayers at the beginning of every session. And usually both chambers are pretty busy for those prayers. There's one quirk in it. Whenever we get to the Lord's Prayer, we all turn round and face the wall. And nobody's ever managed to give me any explanation as to what that's about. I think it's to do with the fact that in the 17th and 18th century, everybody carried swords who were in Parliament, because it was exclusively male, and it was usually very high class men who had fantastic swords. So I think it's got something to do with that, but I've never ever been able to find out if it's true.
Yeah, and I think in the Commons, don't you put a little card in the seat that you want? You put the card for prayers, although it's actually to sort of book your place. Yeah, okay.
There's 451 seats in the House of Commons, but there are 650 members of Parliament. And you'll get one or two who will come in just to save it. Dennis Skinner used to come in to save his seat and wasn't religious at all. But most of them are actually very religious. And indeed, to join with you tonight, I had to miss the weekly Mass, because there is Mass in the crypt of the House of Commons every Wednesday, with an amazing Irish priest called Canon Pat Brown, who trained as an opera singer. So the hymns are absolutely wonderful, and we all enjoy ourselves at it. And because at school I was taught to sing in parts, I've got to stop myself singing in parts at the Mass.
Yeah. I mean, just looking back again to your election as an MP, certainly in the west of Scotland, something that struck me very strongly when I first moved there in 1995 was the whole issue of sectarianism. And it's something now coming back to Edinburgh many years later, I think I haven't really encountered in the East yet anyway. So it was a surprise. I mean, I'd heard about it, but there was a sort of visceral aspect to it that I wasn't really prepared for. And I think something that you had to face in that election. Can you just share a little bit more with us?
It was pretty shocking, everything that happened. I had thought, because I had actually moved away from Coatbridge and Airdrie and live in the banks of the Clyde at Langbank, I thought the sectarianism had died away. And, to be honest, I was brought up in an Irish Catholic community. Everybody I knew was Irish Catholic. I didn't know anyone who wasn't a Catholic, because that particular community were largely Irish. We lived an Irish life. It was walking funerals. The devotion was something that was very, very privileged. That you always knew there was a lady saying the rosary somewhere at night. And it was a very different, and it wasn't really till I went to university that I actually had any contact with people who weren't Catholics. And of course, there are other parts of that same area that's exclusively Protestant. To some extent, it's because of the path from the Irish famine onwards of settlement in Scotland of the Irish. Because if you think of it from the Ayrshire coast right through the middle of Scotland, you have Irish communities, some of them Catholic, some of them exclusively Catholic, some of them exclusively Protestant. So I was quite shocked when I went back as the candidate, and it became quite a big story. It became quite a worldwide story, was the extent of sectarianism. I can remember doing a debate which was on live television for the Christian Democratic movement, and it was in the High Kirk in Airdrie, which is a beautiful, beautiful building. And forgive the phrase, but as I was walking down the aisle on live television, every time my foot went down, there were quite a few people saying "Fenian bastard, Fenian bastard." And I can remember Michael White of The Guardian saying to me at the end, "Goodness, if that's the Christians, I'd hate to see the Lions." And there were fights breaking out and everything. But it happened the other way around as well. You know, parts of the constituency that was Catholic, people would go to the doors and they'd ask who they were voting for. "Oh, I'm going to vote for Helen Liddell." And they'd be told, "Oh, you know, she married a Protestant." And in the Protestant villages, one very prominent politician went to a door of an elderly man and said, "Who are you going to vote for?" And he said, "Oh, I'm going to vote for Helen Liddell." And in shock, this man said, "But you know, she's a Catholic." To which the old man replied, "Yes, because she's married to my nephew and I baked the cake for her wedding day." But it happened on both sides. You can't blame one side or the other. Both sides were as bad as each other.
Yeah. And have you noticed an improvement?
Yeah, I must admit, once the by-election was over, it did improve. And I ended up with a very good relationship with the Orange Order because some of the communities that they were in, it needed reach out. And because a lot of the Catholic communities I knew quite well to start with, the Orange Order helped me get to grips with quite a lot of the problems that there were in some of the more outlying villages. And, I think it has. I think these problems have died down, but that could just be me romanticising it. But I felt by the time I'd left, which was 11 years later, I didn't really sense the sectarianism that had been there during that pretty awful campaign.
Yeah, yeah. And then 2001, Secretary of State for Scotland. You know, as you go into that job, what were your priorities, and you know, what were the things you were looking at?
Well, when I went into that job, it was at the time of this, you know, starting to get devolution settled down, and I more or less had the job of sort of holding the jackets from different departments, fell out about things. But I was also the first woman in 150 years, still the only woman to have been Secretary of State for Scotland. And that was a little bit of a culture shock to people, particularly to different kinds of societies who never really had anything to do with women in very significant jobs. I can always remember going to a dinner one night, and it was suggested that you know, the ladies withdraw. And I said, look, the reason I'm here is to talk to you, because I want to find out what's happening, for example, in financial services. And they were quite shocked because they'd never known a woman who was perhaps as cheeky as me. But you know, you had to get the message across that often you're there to listen, but you're also there to try to guide as well. And I was also there at the time of 9/11. I was Secretary of State for Scotland. And the Prime Minister asked me if I would go out to New York a month, you know, for the month after the date that's a month after it happened. And I'd laid a wreath on behalf of the Scots. And it was quite touching to see the extent to which people appreciated people coming from other countries, but also that they had a sort of religious background. One of the places that people got into when that horrible thing happened that day was the Church of St. Thomas, which was a Catholic church. And the next day, I was told of how crowded everything was, and how, you know, people got solace from praying. And the next day, I went out to a place, out by the docks. They had managed to turn a lot of the sort of barn-like structures out there into receiving places for people with all sorts of services around. And I saw a nun, and I went over and had a chat with her. And the reason she was there was they looked after animals, and they were allowed into all the apartments to bring out dogs and cats and rabbits and things like that were locked in the flats. And you don't think of nuns doing things like that, but they had this dedication to it. So it was a pretty horrible experience, but in a sense, it was quite an uplifting experience. And the Prime Minister had sent me there because, well, you know, as a woman in politics, you learn to get people to talk to you, because sometimes they're a bit put off. And it did work out. You know, I did get people to talk and to be able to report back as to what was happening on the ground with real people, as distinct from leaders of communities, if that makes any sense.
No, it does, indeed it does, yeah. Can I just pause for a second and just remind everybody, if you do have questions or comments as we go, please do send them on the chat, not to everyone, but to Andrew Cassidy. And Andrew will then forward them on so that we can look at those as we go. Okay. So just while we're talking about the role of Secretary of State for Scotland, just before we came on to talk here publicly, we briefly mentioned the Supreme Court decision this morning. There's possibly not a vast amount we can say about it, but I just thought people might be interested in your reaction to that judgment this morning on the possibility of a Scottish independence referendum.
Well, it didn't come as any surprise, because the legislation is actually quite clear. It's not in a part of the legislation that's a bit opaque, but it is absolutely clear. And I don't think there is any country in the world that would permit a situation where you could disrupt the union of a country without having the government of that country involved in it. So it didn't come as any kind of surprise in political circles, because everybody anticipated it was going to happen.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So just moving on then, the appointment of High Commissioner in Australia in 2005. Was Australia somewhere you knew previously, or was this a new discovery for you?
I'd been down to Australia, and I always had the reputation in government as being the one who's been sent out to do things, to get things fixed. The very first thing I had to do was sort out personal pensions mis-selling. When I went to the Treasury, and I had to start that on, sort of day 3, and we got it done, we got it sorted out. And then when I was Energy Minister, I had to sort out the biggest personal injuries scheme in the world, which was for miners who had developed lung disease and died of lung disease, and a court action had meant they had to be given compensation, but the compensation had to be reduced if they were smokers. So I had to sort all of that out. So I had this reputation for always sort of catching bullets in my teeth. So I had gone down to Australia because the Australians had wanted somebody to come and talk to them about how we dealt with banks, and how when we made the Bank of England operationally independent, how we managed that, basically. And although it was way out with my remit as Secretary of State, I had actually done a lot of the work for the operational independence of the Bank of England. So I went down, and I said to my husband, why don't you come with me? Because it's a long way away, and I was going to be away for a couple of weeks. And we absolutely loved it. And when I came back, I was in a corridor in the House of Commons and bumped into the Prime Minister, who said to me, "Oh, how was Australia? Did you enjoy it?" I said, "I absolutely loved it. If I was 20 years younger, my bags would be packed and I would be on my way." What I didn't know was that he lived in Australia until he was about 6, because his father was a lecturer in law at the University of Adelaide. And this put thoughts into his mind. And I had said that I had wanted to leave Parliament, because I'd always said I would do 10 years. I ended up doing 11 years. And he knew I was thinking of things to do, because my husband has a very successful career, and I was holding him back because he had to keep the household together. So he knew I was thinking about moving on. And one day I got a phone call saying, "How would you feel about going to Australia?" And I said, "Oh, Tony, I would love to do it, but I can't do it because I'm an only child. My father lives with me. He's in his 80s. I can't do it." And he said to me, "Go and phone your father." So I went and phoned my father, and my father said, "Lassie, I can die anywhere." So he came, and he did die in Australia, but he came with us. So we went down to Australia, and it was pretty full on. It was 4 years of very full on. And one of the things I had to do was to get the Australians, who are great climate skeptics because of the amount of coal and minerals that they have, to sign the Kyoto Protocol. So I managed to get that done. And as a consequence, it meant that I had got out and about and spoke to an awful lot of people. So it was a very interesting and exciting time. But one thing I did find, harking back to our discussion of faith, I was really taken aback to discover that Australia is really, at that time, was a Catholic country. For the Easter weekend on Good Friday, everything shuts at 12 o'clock, and it doesn't open again till about 6 o'clock on the Saturday night. First Communions in Canberra, there was a parade of First Communicants through the centre of the city, and everything closed down for those First Communicants. And on one occasion, you just had this sense when Parliament was being opened. When Parliament's being opened here, a lot of the services are Church of England services. All of the services in Canberra, the capital of Australia, were all in the Catholic Cathedral. And it was astonishing how many Catholics there were at senior levels of government. But there is one sad story in that I used to go to 8 o'clock Mass on a Sunday morning. And if I didn't get parked by about 25 to 8, I'd be in some difficulty because so many people were going to Mass in St Christopher's Cathedral, seats probably about 2,000 people. And I always loved going to Mass. Then my husband would walk down, we'd go and have a coffee with our dog afterwards. And I was back about 4 years ago, and I went, I thought, right, I'll go to 8 o'clock Mass again. I went to St Christopher's and all the doors were closed. So I went into an Italian restaurant and where I knew the woman, and she said, oh no, I thought maybe the times had been changed. She said, no, hardly anybody goes to Mass now. And it was the problem that, oddly enough, I ended up having to think about when I came back here, about abuse of children and abuse across the church, because so many people had turned against the church and they didn't feel that they wanted to go to Mass anymore. And I was quite shocked. I spoke to some of my friends who were Catholics, and they said, yeah, there was a profound impact on the church in Australia. And when I ended up chairing the independent review group on safeguarding for the Catholic Church in Scotland, and always in my mind was the devastating consequences of not taking into account getting safeguarding and protection right. So that's a pretty sad story about my time in Australia.
Yeah, but an important legacy that you contributed in Scotland. I mean, just on that, I mean, things have progressed since then. Is your sense that we have good and robust arrangements in the Catholic Church?
Well, the final conclusions of the independent review group, which finished its work in October, that was almost 5 years of work, was that an independent organisation should be set up and of professionals. And that is what's happened. And the oversight is going to be done by a professionalised group. And ironically, the person who's going to chair it is Lady Ray, the High Court judge, who actually sat next to me at school. So St Patrick's School has even more influence now than it had before. But professionalising it and a one church approach. I suspect most of the people listening to this would know that a bishop is a sort of prince in his own diocese, but you can't do that with something that is as significant as safeguarding. There has to be a one church approach, and the bishops adopted that. And it could have been quite difficult for them because we had to give them hard messages. But at the end of the day, they listened to those messages. And I think where they are now is modern, it's professional, and I think will help us deal with people who are terribly, terribly wounded as a result of things that have happened to them.
Okay, thank you. Just going back to something you said about Australia, you were talking about persuading them on climate change and energy use. Now, it's something you're interested in, that you're involved in Energy Action Scotland and carbon capture. Did that come out of Australia, or is that something that existed before? And you know, what's your sort of interest and engagement now in those green issues?
Well, I was the energy minister for a while, and my constituency was a mining constituency, and indeed my family were miners. There's actually a funny aside, because my grandfather on his deathbed, he was dying of silicosis, and he had 13 of a family, and he gathered together all his remaining family and made them promise, because he'd already lost 2 sons to the illnesses caused by mining, and he said to all of his family, please promise me that no one will ever go down a pit again in our family. I became the energy minister, and I'm the only energy minister ever not to go down a pit, which was much to the delight of Arthur Scargill, who attacked me for not going down a pit. So I just held my story back until I had a big enough audience, and then used it. But I've always been interested in energy, and as an economist, I did a lot in oil and gas. But Energy Action Scotland is a fuel poverty charity. In fact, it's probably the leading fuel poverty charity in Scotland, and it tries to encourage people, which is much more important now than it was even a year ago, to use less energy because it is expensive, and poor people often cannot afford to heat their houses or cook their foods. And carbon capture and storage I get interested in years ago when we had got the start of all the oil and gas in Scotland. Basically what you do is you capture the carbon and you bury it in empty oil fields. It's quite expensive, but you can do it. And as soon as you've done it, it starts getting an awful lot cheaper as time goes on. And it's now a sort of flavour of the year, not because of me, but because people are now very alert to the need to get carbon out of our environment. So that's how I became involved in all of these things.
And if we've just had COP27 coming to a conclusion in Egypt, and I think we're at a point where the vast majority of people in the UK anyway would accept that the climate crisis is very real and very urgent, and maybe even the 1.5 degree rise in temperature is an unacceptable one. What's your sense of, what's the dilemma that politicians are in over this sort of thing? Why don't they just make the radical choices to massively cut our energy use?
Well, it takes time and it takes money. And if you say to people, don't put your gas fire on, how are they going to cope whenever it's cold? And decisions that were taken years ago about our reliance, long before people thought about climate change, if you rely on oil and gas, for example, that does create climate challenges. France, for example, has a much better record than we do because they've got a lot of nuclear. But we backed off nuclear. Germany backed off nuclear. But it does make sure that the carbon levels are much lower. So it's basically moving to different technologies, which are extremely expensive in some cases, and saying to people, now don't do this, don't do that, often when people don't have the money to do anything else. Almost all of our cars now use petrol or diesel, and we have to move away from that and move to EV or hybrid cars, and because in the atmosphere, the amount of carbon is increasing. But there are technologies coming along. There's direct air capture of carbon is still an infant industry, but it's coming along. And I would have thought within 5 years, direct air capture would become something that would be around in most communities. So this is not something where you can press a switch and change it. It takes a lot of time, and it does take a lot of money. Yeah.
So just going back to High Commissioner of Australia, is that an appointment for a particular term, or do you decide? It is. So after the 4 years, you finished with that, and then you returned, and then went to the House of Lords in 2010. So just talk to us a little bit about what the House of Lords does and how that feels, and how much, compared to being an MP, do you feel you have the power and the influence and in the Lords in the same sort of way, or is it a very different sort of experience?
It's very different. It's very, very different. I had initially said I didn't really fancy going to the House of Lords, but I got talked into it to some extent because people, if you're a Labour member of the House of Lords, you have to sign up to reform of the House of Lords. So you want as many people who are reformers in as possible. But it was also because I was the first woman Secretary of State for Scotland and the first woman non-career diplomat to hold a senior diplomatic posting. So that was the background to it. And also, it's a revising chamber. The House of Lords revises and does the detail. And there are a lot of people, nobody in the House of Lords is particularly young. So you've got lots of people with lots of experience, many of whom are not politicians. They've not come in from the sort of political route. And I used to go in and listen to the Lords if I was taking complex legislation through, say, in engineering, because I'm not an engineer. I don't even know how to change a plug. So it was important to me to hear engineers talking about what could be done. And the crossbenchers have a lot of, Nobel Prize winners and famous people and so on. And you get that change in the legislation. But sometimes we have to fight with the House of Commons, but we do not fight with the House of Commons indefinitely. 3 times we will send something back. We'll say, right, we think you've got this wrong, have another look at it. Oops, you've come back and said you're keeping it. We'll try it a 3rd time and then we will back down. So we give them the opportunity and then we will back down. And that's one of the things that's quite difficult to deal with if you have reform, because reform of the House of Lords would be terrible if it challenged the House of Commons. And because that's the directly elected chamber and they should have preeminence. And in the Lords, you have lots of people who do others. We don't get a salary or anything like that. You can claim expenses, but you have people who are still working. And I still do another couple of things. And it's, you're in touch with what's happening in various communities. And that's very, very important. There was a John McFall, who's the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords, also a Catholic from Dumbarton. John last night hosted a reception organised by a Conservative peer, Lady Francis, and she is an expert in cerebral palsy. And he has a little grandson with cerebral palsy. And because of that, lots of medics were able to come and explain different treatments and different ways of working with lovely young children with cerebral palsy. So you've got that kind of environment that you don't necessarily have in the House of Commons. The big problem is you're a Lord for life, so it makes the place look as if it's very full, but it's not actually. It's down slightly under 400, although there are 800 Lords, yeah. But most are too old or disinterested.
And the news media have reported Keir Starmer's comments this week about the abolition of the Lords as it is, or the reform of the Lords. I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? That if you have a directly elected chamber, then there's this problem of the potential challenge to the Commons, as you have, for example, in Italy, as you have in the United States. But how do you appoint those people of experience and expertise that you were talking about if it's not done politically?
Well, that's the difficulty. And what Keir Starmer has been talking about has actually been party policy since the late 1990s. We did a big reform of the House of Lords in the 1990s. We took the hereditaries out, yeah. But we couldn't get them all out completely. So there are 90 hereditaries still remaining, and they vote among themselves as to who comes in, but I think there was something like 1,000 hereditaries. So the difficulty is the people, the experts, mostly the crossbenchers. Crossbenchers aren't going to stand for election. So I don't know how you can develop a system that would bring those experts in, because the House of Lords doesn't tend to sort of blow its own trumpet, but it is the most expert chamber in the world because of the nature of the people who are there. So you're not going to get people who are, High Court judges or Nobel Prizes in medicine, or the guys who've run major orchestras. You're not going to get them standing for election. So that still needs to be worked out. I think we can find ways of working it out, but we've really got to find out how that can be coped with. And the other thing too with reform, constitutional reform, takes up a huge amount of time.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you that the Labour Party is committed to doing this, but faced with war in Ukraine, energy crisis, etc., etc., is anybody really going to devote parliamentary time to it?
Well, the problem is constitutional change needs to go through both houses more or less simultaneously. And the last time we did it, when we got rid of the hereditaries and reformed the House of Lords, we all ended up bringing sleeping bags in, because for weeks we were actually sleeping on the floor of our offices. because they were going through the night constantly, because it was going to be very difficult to get this legislation finished in in a fair chunk of time. So that kind of thing is actually quite difficult, and it's hard, particularly when there are so many crises around. But we do need a much more modern system, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that's always the dilemma.
Yeah, maybe it will come with the modernization of the buildings of the estate at Westminster. Who knows?
Oh no, that's impossible.
Okay. Can I ask? So, the bishops in the Lords, the Anglican bishops in the Lords, that's presumably an element of faith in the Lords. Good thing, not good thing?
Well, given that the Church of England is the established church, and they actually make quite a contribution. Justin Welby, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's an ex-banker, and he actually speaks quite a lot on treasury matters. It is quite unusual, and of course they wear their robes, but they tend to be there maybe 3 or 4 years at a time. Some of them, well, a couple of them have actually come back as lords because of the contribution that they have made. But it is strange, and we're in a very strange situation at the moment, in that we have the first Roman Catholic Lord Speaker in John McFall, and of course all the prayers and everything are led by Church of England. And we know we are inhabitants of the real world, so we deal with these things. And in the House of Commons, we had the late Michael Martin, who was a Roman Catholic, and his chaplain was a Church of England chaplain. There's actually, when Tony Blair was converting to Catholicism, one of the reasons why he had to wait until he left Parliament, or till he left the office of Prime Minister, is that the Prime Minister actually plays a role in the appointment of bishops of the Church of England, and the church commissioners were very, very nervous about a Prime Minister converting, and Tony was taking instruction anyway, so he had to leave it until after he left the number 10 to convert to Catholicism.
If my memory serves correctly, and I'm not sure how accurate this was, because it's the kind of thing that gets picked up in the press and may not have a lot of substance to it, but there was a thought at one point of Cardinal Hume becoming a member of the Lords. Again, I think people were quite divided on that, and I think Rome certainly thought this was a bad idea. But yes, no?
I don't see any argument against it. Well, it used to be that the ambassador to the Holy See always had to be Church of England, and they changed that. Must have been about 10, 15 years ago. They changed that, and we've had a few Catholics. A friend of mine, Francis Campbell, was ambassador to the Holy See. But today I was the moderator this morning at the service was talking about the accord that had been signed last week in Dunfermline, with a rapport between the Church of Scotland and the Roman Catholic Church. And who'd have thought, when I was having my sectarian battles, that would happen? But it has happened, and I think we're becoming much more grown up in how we deal with people of other faiths.
Yes.
The faith is not just Christian, and it's not just Catholic. It has to embrace everyone, and we have to have due respect to everyone of faith, regardless of what it is.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that accord, because we were very fortunate to have Archbishop Cushley came and spoke to us on that precisely, and it was fascinating listening to how that had actually evolved. Can I remind everybody that we're coming to the time for questions, or this may run out if you're not quick. So if you have a question or a thought that you'd like to put to Lady Helen, now's the time to do it. If you can send that in chat to Andrew. We have one question, which is, was there ever a moment in your political career that you found challenged your faith?
That's quite a difficult one. I think if you lead a complex life, you will find your faith challenged. and you have to negotiate ways through it, either through prayer or through talking to people who will give you guidance. I think that you do have the kind of challenge that if you have faith, you're actually helped by that. It must be much harder for people who are having to take major decisions or deal with terrible, terrible problems who don't have faith, because they must see that the world is just going to hell in a handcap, more or less. So it's always there, and it's not something that you sort of wear on your sleeve, because people know that you are someone of faith. So I don't think there was ever a point where I said, right, I think I'm going to walk away from this either the job or the faith. I don't think that's ever happened to me.
Mm. And in terms of balancing, because as you were saying earlier, at the general election, in Scotland, it's not going to, or not very likely to be a one-issue election. It's not in the end going to end up being about independence. I mean, as a politician, you do have to balance things which you may find you radically disagree with, but it's that balancing and sort of, in a sense, achieving what's possible. And some people, I think, who see the world perhaps in slightly more black and white terms, find that quite hard to accept. It seems that politicians are sometimes or somehow unprincipled because of that. Do you have any reflection?
If there is a radical issue, if there is something radical that you cannot accept, you have to resign. There's no two ways about that. You really have to do that. But often, especially if you're quite a senior politician, you see all sides of the story, and you have to take into account how that story plays out. Now, I often find myself, I do quite a lot in the defence field. And, everybody has various views on defence, and they think, oh, no, don't want anything to do with guns or anything like that. But the reality is the only way we are going to help the Ukrainians is by sending weaponry and increasingly training people to use that weaponry. Now, you could say, oh, no, I can't do that, thou shalt not kill. But what would be worse for the Ukrainians would be if we left them alone and left them to be slaughtered, as we're seeing at the moment, by Vladimir Putin. So you've got to, you never take simple decisions. Your decisions are often quite complex. And often if you have a complex decision, you go and talk to people on both sides of it who have a very clear view of their side of the story and the other side of the story, and then you have to take your own decisions. But if you still cannot acknowledge a particular position, you have to walk.
I mean, just picking, it was interesting you raised Ukraine, so questions come up about Ukraine. I mean, in our church here, we've been praying for the people of Ukraine every Sunday in the bidding prayers, as many people have. And somebody spoke to me on Sunday, actually, and said, how come we're not praying for the people of Russia as well? And we have, in fact, put that in on a number of occasions. I mean, do you have a view on what should our attitude towards Russia be?
Well, I think an awful lot of ordinary Russian citizens are fed a pack of lies, frankly. A, about what's happening in Ukraine, and B, why it's happening. You have a dictator who is laying down the law, and you have some terrible situations with people jailed or killed for just disagreeing with Vladimir Putin. So, prayer for Ukraine matters, but help for Ukraine matters as well. We have, for example, in Parliament, every Wednesday, we have the Rosary for Ukraine, and Russia is mentioned then. Russians, partly because of how they were treated, those of faith were treated during the years of communism, actually have re-engaged with their faith. And I spent some time in Russia, not an awful lot of time, but some time in Russia. And, when you go on a Sunday morning, well, for a start, their masses are about 3 hours long and you're standing, so you don't forget it very quickly. But they do have a great belief in God, and that God can help them. And I can't see that God would really have an awful lot of good things to say about Vladimir Putin with the way that he has behaved. So, prayer for Ukraine is important, but it's just as important to make sure that we save as many lives as possible.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we've got here: has the position of women in Parliament really changed for the better?
We're still a minority. We're still quite a considerable minority. It's got better, I think. When I first went in 1994, there were only about 20 women. And the funny thing is we all got on very well. There was one little room that had a bed in it and an ironing board, interestingly, which was much used. And we all used to gather there because in those days we would vote at 1 and 2 in the morning. On a good night, we'd finish at 10. On a bad night, it might be 1 or 2 in the morning. So you get to the point where you can't keep on working. So there was a great camaraderie at that time. Then it went up to 100 in 97. And we began to see women in very significant posts. And indeed, the only woman in the history of Parliament is the Speaker of the House of Commons, Betty Boothroyd. And that was a very, very significant change. But we've still got a way to go. It's still, in 1958, the life peerages were introduced, and that allowed women to come into the Lords. But I think there's only about 120 or something women in the Lords. So we've got a way to go, but we've got to do it based on ability rather than just straightforward gender.
Yeah. And I think we've more or less come to the end of our time. So what next for you?
Oh, I haven't a clue. I'm a granny. I've got a 10-year-old granddaughter and a 2-year-old grandson, and I'm quite enjoying all of that. But people come up with great ideas and say, why would you be interested in this? And then my husband no longer says, oh, you come and talk to me about it, because he just knows I'm going to say, well, all right, I'll see what I can do then. But I'm trying to wean myself off doing that because I would spend more time with him and with my children and my grandchildren. But age creeps up on you. And I don't quite think I've fully acknowledged how, is it 4 years and 10? I'm not quite there yet, but I'm getting very close to it.
Right. Keeps you very grounded, I think. Helen, thank you so much indeed for this evening, for giving up time when I know it's very, very pressured for you, and for taking us on this absolutely fascinating journey through your involvement in economics, in politics, and in some of the really important social issues of the day. So I think it's difficult. We're all muted, so this is very strange, but on everybody's behalf who's here and who will watch this subsequently, Baroness Helen Liddell, thank you very much indeed for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I wish I could have been there personally.
Maybe another time.
Thank you.
So just to say to everyone, we're coming towards the end of our term of events. We do have an event much later in December, which is a reflection on the incarnation in art, which you might like to join us for. And details of that are on the Edinburgh Jesuit Centre website. So please do have a look there. Otherwise, thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Andrew for being our IT manager this evening. Have a very good evening. Good night.